An empathetic man represents something deeply unsettling to a narcissistic woman, not because he is weak, but because he is perceptive. Empathy, when mature, is not blind kindness. It is a refined psychological instrument. It allows a man to feel emotional undercurrents, to notice when words and actions do not align, to sense when warmth is performative rather than genuine. And this capacity quietly threatens anyone who survives through illusion. A narcissistic personality depends on being seen in fragments rather than as a whole. Charm here, vulnerability there, control disguised as care. Empathetic men, especially those who have reflected on their inner lives, do something dangerous. They connect patterns. They don't just hear what is said, they feel what is avoided. They notice emotional inflation followed by sudden withdrawal. They sense when affection has conditions attached. This awareness disrupts the carefully managed image that narcissism requires to function. What she fears is not confrontation, but recognition. Once you recognize a pattern, you can no longer be hypnotized by it. Empathy allows you to hold two truths at once, understanding someone's wounds without excusing their behavior. And that balance is lethal to manipulation. A narcissistic woman may tolerate obedience, admiration, even resentment, but she cannot tolerate being truly seen without control over the narrative. This is why empathetic men are often targeted first and discarded later. Your depth makes you valuable as emotional supply, but dangerous as an observer. You begin by offering understanding, but over time you start asking silent questions. Why does closeness feel conditional? Why does your exhaustion increase as you give more? Why does self-doubt grow while she remains certain? These questions mark the beginning of psychological independence. Empathy, when unconscious, can be exploited, but empathy paired with self-awareness becomes discernment. And discernment removes power from those who rely on confusion to dominate. That is why this message matters. It does not ask you to become colder. It asks you to become clearer. Because the moment empathy turns inward, toward truth instead of appeasement, control ends and freedom begins. Your kindness, your patience, your willingness to understand, these are not neutral qualities in the eyes of a narcissistic woman. To her, they are fuel. She does not value empathy as a bridge toward connection. She values it as currency, a means to sustain her sense of importance. When you give freely of your heart, when you validate, excuse, or accommodate behaviors that chip away at your own sense of self, she thrives, and she hopes you will never see it. The subtle danger lies not in grand manipulations, but in the quiet, persistent siphoning of emotional energy. You may think you are giving love, attention, or support, and indeed you are, but the narcissist treats these gifts as a resource to be extracted, not a bond to be nurtured. Every act of empathy becomes a silent contract. You invest, she consumes, and your inner balance diminishes. The more you give without reflection, the more indispensable you seem, and the more power she accrues over your perceptions, your emotions, your very sense of reality. What is important to understand is that this dynamic is rarely obvious at first. It unfolds slowly, almost imperceptibly. You feel responsible for her moods, for the fractures in her satisfaction, for the invisible weight of her expectations. In time, you begin to ask yourself why your generosity feels exhausting rather than fulfilling. That exhaustion is not a failure of empathy. It is a warning signal. It is a mirror reflecting that what you have offered in abundance has been taken as a right, not cherished as a gift. The awakening comes when you realize that your empathy need not be a conduit for her control. Empathy is a strength, but it requires boundaries. It requires reflection, discernment, and the courage to withhold what is being misused. To see that giving freely does not mean surrendering your autonomy is to reclaim a power she never intended you to have. Because when you understand that your compassion is a treasure, not a tool for her, you step out of the cycle. You stop feeding what depletes you. And in that decisive act, you become untouchable, not through force, but through awareness and self-respect. The moment an empathetic man begins to recognize the patterns of manipulation, a subtle but profound shift occurs. Narcissism thrives on repetition and predictability, on the assurance that others will remain blind to the underlying structure of control. There is a cycle: idealization, attention, intimacy, followed by devaluation, withdrawal, and confusion. For someone caught in it without awareness, the cycle feels like chaos, or worse, personal failure. But an empathetic man who understands this pattern sees clarity where there was once illusion. He begins to separate behavior from intention, action from narrative, and in doing so, he no longer participates unknowingly in the game. Recognition does not require confrontation, nor does it demand aggression. It is, in its purest form, observation combined with insight. An empathetic man notices the subtle shifts in tone, the withdrawal of affection when his autonomy is asserted, the small manipulations that erode self-confidence. These are not isolated incidents. They are threads in a larger design. And once the design is perceived, it loses its power. What was once subtle control becomes transparent. And transparency is incompatible with manipulation. This understanding brings freedom, but it also brings responsibility. To recognize a pattern is to know that action must follow awareness. It is not enough to see the illusions. One must also refrain from feeding them. The narcissist relies on continued participation, on the victim's willingness to interpret, excuse, and engage with behaviors that are fundamentally harmful. Awareness alone disrupts this dynamic. The hypnotic effect fades when the observer refuses to be misled, when he interprets actions through the lens of clarity rather than hope, fear, or guilt. The danger for the narcissist is not a single act of defiance, but the quiet, steady acknowledgement of reality. Recognition erodes influence incrementally but irreversibly. And the moment an empathetic man fully sees the pattern, he can no longer be controlled by charm, fear, or deceit. His autonomy, once clouded, is restored. Because awareness is not a weapon, it is a shield. And once the cycle is recognized, the power of illusion ends, leaving only one truth: clarity cannot be bargained with, ignored, or taken away. It simply exists, and it transforms everything it touches. Boundaries are perhaps the most misunderstood and underestimated force in human relationships. For an empathetic man, they are not walls meant to shut others out, but markers of self-respect, indicators of where his responsibility begins and ends. To a narcissistic woman, however, boundaries are terrifying. They represent a refusal to participate in her carefully orchestrated world, a refusal to validate manipulation or supply her with unquestioned attention. She has thrived in environments where rules are invisible and limits are porous, where her desires always take precedence. When an empathetic man asserts limits, the illusion of control begins to crack. What makes boundaries so powerful is that they are both silent and absolute. They do not require argument, explanation, or justification. They simply exist, and their existence carries consequences. When a man refuses to be drawn into emotional blackmail, when he declines to compensate for her instability, when he stops explaining away her contradictions, he communicates something that no charm or argument can erase. He will no longer be manipulated. This is not anger, it is clarity. It is the recognition that one's own well-being is non-negotiable, and it is expressed not with aggression, but with quiet, unwavering resolve. For the narcissist, this refusal is threatening because it undermines her identity as a figure of influence. She has relied on a subtle, almost invisible leverage over others' emotions, and when an empathetic man erects boundaries, she can no longer pull the strings. Every attempt to charm, guilt, or intimidate is met with a calm and consistent refusal. And the more consistent the boundaries, the less room remains for manipulation. What she fears is not confrontation, but the erosion of power, the slow but relentless establishment of autonomy that cannot be broken. Boundaries, therefore, are not merely defensive. They are transformative. They shift the dynamic from one of control to one of mutual respect, from obligation to choice, from chaos to clarity. They demonstrate that empathy is not weakness and compassion is not surrender. Because a man who honors his own limits becomes untouchable, not because he dominates, but because he refuses to be consumed. And in that refusal lies a power no narcissist can ever reclaim. Confusion is a powerful tool, and it is one that a narcissistic woman wields with remarkable precision. She does not need to raise her voice or demand obedience. She simply allows ambiguity to flourish, inconsistencies in words and actions, sudden withdrawal, ails of attention, subtle criticisms disguised as concern. These are the instruments of emotional chaos. For someone who is empathetic, who naturally seeks understanding and harmony, this uncertainty can be intoxicating and exhausting all at once. It keeps you engaged, questioning yourself, trying to repair what may not be broken. And that is exactly the point. She wants you unsettled, because unsettled minds are malleable. When you are unsure of your own judgment, when you doubt your perceptions, her influence grows. You begin to internalize confusion as personal failure. You analyze every gesture, every tone, every silence, searching for meaning, trying to anticipate reactions. And in this invisible struggle, she remains in control, untouched by your efforts, secure in the knowledge that clarity has not yet reached you. But the moment clarity enters, everything changes. An empathetic man who learns to see beyond the fog begins to recognize patterns where there once seemed only chaos. He sees the cycles, the triggers, the subtle manipulations. He understands that the confusion was never about him, but about control. And with this understanding comes liberation. Awareness turns uncertainty into insight. Recognition replaces doubt. The very tool she used to maintain power, confusion, becomes powerless in the hands of someone who refuses to be misled. This is why clarity is both a threat and a weapon, not because it seeks to punish, but because it refuses to participate in deception. Once you see the structure beneath the chaos, you no longer expend energy repairing illusions that were never meant to endure. You engage with reality instead of fantasy, and in doing so, you reclaim your autonomy. Confusion cannot survive the light of understanding. And the man who chooses clarity is no longer a participant in manipulation. He is a witness to it, free to act, free to step away, free to preserve his own integrity above all else. The final truth that a narcissistic woman fears is the emergence of self-respect in the men she targets. She has spent years learning to exploit compliance, to extract emotional energy, to bend empathy into submission. But self-respect is impervious to charm, impervious to guilt, impervious to manipulation. When an empathetic man chooses himself over the endless demands of someone else's ego, he crosses a threshold that cannot be undone. This is not about hardness or cruelty. It is about presence, awareness, and the refusal to be consumed by another's need for control. Self-respect is the culmination of awareness, discernment, and boundary setting. It begins quietly, in small acts, saying no without apology, acknowledging your own needs without guilt, refusing to validate behaviors that diminish your worth. Each decision reinforces a sense of integrity that cannot be borrowed or stolen. For a narcissist, such integrity is dangerous because it eliminates leverage. She cannot provoke guilt in someone who refuses to accept it. She cannot instill fear in someone who has faced his own vulnerabilities and honored them. And most importantly, she cannot return to a man who has awakened to his own value because he no longer fits into her system of control. This is why self-respect is not merely defensive, it is transformative. It transforms relationships from dependency into autonomy, from chaos into clarity. It allows a man to participate in life fully, to give without sacrificing his center, to love without losing himself. And it creates a boundary that is absolute. You are no longer available as a source of emotional fuel for someone who thrives on imbalance. The power of this transformation is subtle, yet irreversible. Once a man chooses self-respect, the dynamics of manipulation collapse. He does not need to fig, HT, or confront. The very structure that sustained narcissistic influence cannot survive in the presence of unwavering self-worth. Because when you honor yourself above the compulsions of another, you claim a freedom that no charm, no deception, no emotional strategy can ever take away. And in that freedom lies the ultimate truth. A man who respects himself becomes untouchable, not through force, but through the quiet, unassailable power of his own integrity.